Hello again, and welcome to another podcast. Now, in this one, and in fact, the next podcast, I'm going to talk a lot about how you get sharp photographs and why sometimes they don't look sharp. So, with this first part of this pair of podcasts, I'm going to talk about autofocus systems because this is pretty fundamental. If you don't understand your autofocus system, you're likely to get into trouble. So, I'm just going to run through 4 scenarios. They're the most common scenarios that you're likely to come up against, particularly in wildlife. I'm going to talk about what those scenarios are, what you can do about them, and also I'm going to talk a little bit about how different autofocus systems work. And it's not to give you a lot of technical information you don't need, because I'm not a fan of that. But I think it is important that you have a basic understanding of how the autofocus system works so that you can recognize when you're in a situation where it may not work for you. And obviously, you need that working for you in order to get good shots, particularly if you're photographing an event that might be a one-off. So, for example, predator taking down prey, humpback whale breaching, things like that. So, please remember to like and subscribe, and I'll dive into it. So, first of all, the thing to remember is that autofocus loves lots and lots of light. And there are some good reasons for that. One is with a lot of light, it can see what's going on, to use a phrase. Also, what autofocus systems look for is primarily contrast. And so they need to be able to identify where something is. Basically, they've got to be able to see it. So before I dive in, I'm going to talk about how, just a very brief introduction into how autofocus systems operate. So there are 3 main types. Now, the first one is called phase detect autofocus, and this is used in DSLRs and modern mirrorless cameras. So this is so depending on what kind of camera you've got, you may or may not be working with this. But how does it work? Basically, the camera splits the incoming image into 2 images, and it uses special autofocus sensors or on-sensor phase detect autofocus pixels. And essentially, it's producing 2 pictures. What the processor, so the computer in the lens does, in the AF system does, is just compare the 2 images. And if they're not exact, if they don't overlap precisely, that means the subject is out of focus. And the advantage of this system is that it immediately knows how far the lens is misfocused and which direction it has to move the lens basically to focus. So if you think of the focusing ring, it knows whether to turn it to the left or to the right. That means it doesn't hunt. So that's why these systems are much faster. And this is why you get them on modern cameras or the latest cameras. Because it's not hunting, you lose that delay that you get in older systems that you might well be familiar with. It knows the direction, it knows distance of correction immediately. So what it's really good at, it's working with faster action, where you're trying to track a subject, and basically anywhere where you need the focus to adjust really, really quickly. So this is the fastest system you're likely to be using. Now, another system is called contrast detect autofocus, the CDAF. This is a system that's used in compact cameras, older mirrorless bodies, and often video on the video autofocus on some systems. What this system does is the camera evaluates the contrast in the image on the sensor. So a sharply focused subject produces maximum contrast. So essentially what it does is move the lens backwards and forwards until the point of highest contrast is found. This is a slower system because the camera, the processor, really doesn't know which way the focus is out, so it will tend to hunt. So it will go backwards and forwards to try and find that point of highest contrast. So this system produces a very accurate focus, and it's very good where you've got static subjects and well-lit scenes with clear edges. So this is where this one is very good, clearly because of that hunting element. And I remember this with the original autofocus systems I started using way back. That was definitely a feature of those lenses. They'd start hunting. And this is why I would tend to pre-focus them as much as I could to just minimize that hunting distance. And then finally, there is hybrid autofocus. So this is the combination of the two I've just described, and also artificial intelligence. So the other systems are phase detect, contrast detect, and you combine that with AI. So this is used in most modern mirrorless cameras. So the phase detect aspect quickly estimates the focus distance and direction. The contrast detect fine-tunes that focus, so you get and confirms maximum sharpness. And then the AI-based part of it, that is used to identify faces, eyes, animals, vehicles, objects, anything you're basically likely to be focused on. So the advantage of this system and why it's used a lot now is you get the speed that you will find in the phase detect autofocus system. You get the accuracy of contrast detect, and the AI aspect is used to start recognizing specific things. So whether it's an eye or a face or whatever. So these are the systems you're likely to be using. So depending on how old your system is, you'll be using one of these systems. And basically, if your lens starts to hunt, you're probably using contrast detect. So I've gone into that. It's possibly a little bit more than is needed, but I wanted to give you an idea of how these systems actually operate. So the key thing here is having a well-lit scene that allows the AF system to find what it's looking for, to have two clear images that are not overlapping, to have really good contrast so it can identify maximum contrast. So clearly there are situations where those are going to be a problem. So the first one of those is low light or low contrast conditions. So obviously in either of those two scenarios, it's going to be very hard for the AF system to get a good enough image to provide a focus. The highest point of contrast might be very close to the lowest point of contrast. So if you've got an older system, it might be hunting a lot. So this definitely is likely to throw off the AF system. So what can you do in that scenario? First thing, so this is, first of all, just sticking with the AF system itself, is use a wider aperture. So if you can get down to somewhere like f1.8 to f4 rather than the f8 to f11, just as examples, but basically get the widest aperture you can get, so you've got the maximum amount of light coming in. That gives the camera the best chance of being able to use the AF system. If you increase the ISO, that will tend to brighten the scene, so that might also make a difference for you. So you're increasing the sensitivity of the sensor. You can use a slower shutter speed if the subject allows, maybe somewhere in the 1/60th to the 1/25th range in low light. If you've got an AF assist lamp, use that, and basically focus on an area with the greatest contrast. So the sort of thing I've done myself when I've been in that situation is just look for an area that's a bit brighter, ideally the same sort of distance away from me as the subject. So you may or may not be able to come up with something like that. It really does depend where you are. But if you can, just get an autofocus reading on that and then switch to manual. So that way you've got a range, go back to manual, and then you can just look at what you can do with the aperture setting to increase your depth of field. And obviously with depth of field, the greater that is, the more of the image will be in focus, basically, because the optics will work. Optics are optics, but you're not relying on the AF system to come up with the focus for you so much. So that's the first scenario that I want to talk about. The second one is where you're using the wrong autofocus area mode for the situation. Now, this is really important that you understand how the autofocus decides what the subject is, because obviously with every frame, you're not telling it specifically. So if you go to your autofocus settings, you will find that you have a variety, and it's likely to be a very wide area. So essentially in the center of the lens, and depending on the camera you're using, it will vary. But there are a whole number. It could be 30, it could be 60 plus, something like that. But a whole number of often little squares that you'll see if you go to the AF settings. And they'll be in the central part of the viewfinder of your image. And basically what you can do there is either to try and use all of them. So what the camera does, it tries to find something that is in focus in that central area of the frame. So you might be looking at the central, maybe 60% of the frame. Or you can bring it right down to one of those little squares, and that's a spot focus. And that means that wherever that square lands in the viewfinder, the image in the viewfinder, that is what you're telling the camera, that's what you want to focus on. So all of these have different applications. It depends on the type of photography that you're doing. And you may already be familiar with this. If you're not, I really recommend you experiment with it so that you understand it. But the tip just to show you what I use the central autofocus point. Just the smallest square I can use. And the reason that I do that is that, and the reason that this is a problem is that if you're, for example, photographing an animal that's hiding in the bush, so it might be surrounded by, a bush, for example, and there might be long grass and stuff like that in the foreground. And if there's a little bit of a breeze going, those things in the foreground are likely to be moving. And in that situation, what I'll be doing is focusing on the nearest eye to me of that animal. And by having that central square, so the smallest possible point to get the correct focus, I know that with that little square on the animal's eye, and then pressing the autofocus button, so I'll come to that in a moment actually, that will give me the correct focus for that animal. And then I just adjust the depth of field so that I've got the face, the features of the face in focus, but anything in the background and in the foreground, excuse me, out of focus. So if this isn't making sense to you, go have a look at the autofocus sensor options that you have, and hopefully you'll see what I'm talking about. If not much of this is making sense, I do really recommend you get a bit of training. So I go into this and give you exercises in my online course, and that is really important to understand how your focusing system is working. Now, just to throw in an additional point, when does the camera just take the focus? At what stage in you pressing the shutter button does the camera actually decide, okay, I'm now going to focus? So by default, so the standard setting on the camera, it will be normally when you push the shutter button halfway down. So when you do that, if you're not familiar with this, again, it's important to understand. When you push the shutter button halfway down, if you've got a hunting type lens, you'll hear it go. But what happens there is that's when the camera decides on the amount of light coming in, and it also decides where the focal point is, where the point you're focusing on. So that's when you do it. Now, there isn't another way of doing that, which I use and a lot of photographers use. I think more, I don't know, I'm guessing probably more professional photographers use, but I don't know that. And that's a thing called back button focusing. And what that is, you basically transfer that function, basically saying to the camera, okay, take the focus now. You switch that function from the shutter button to another button, normally on the back of the camera. So this will depend on the camera that you have. certainly most of the pro and semi-pro models will allow you to do this. I don't know, some of the budget cameras may not. I don't know, again, for sure, because I don't use them. But what you can do with a lot of these cameras, and certainly on the Canons I use, is to reprogram one of the little buttons on the back of the camera, and you reprogram that to be the button that you use to set your focus. And the reason you might want to do that is if you are trying to focus on something that is relatively small in the frame, and particularly if it's moving. So an example of this might be a bird in flight, and it has background and foreground objects that the AF could also pick up. With back button focus, you set your focus on your subject, and once you've actually hit it, so again, I'm using that very small square in the center of the viewfinder. I've got it to focus. I've got the camera focus where I want it. Then it doesn't actually matter where that bird is within the frame and relative to that autofocus spot when I press the shutter button down, because I've already set my focus. The camera knows what the focal distance is, and that's all good. So depending on the kind of photography that you're doing, you may or may not find that useful, but certainly for the photography I do, I find back button focus very useful. So that's something, again, I go into in a lot more detail on the course and the reasons and the area scenarios where you might want to use that. Okay, so that really, though, is the thing to do when you have the wrong area mode. The first thing to do is to understand the area mode and select the right one. If you're working with moving subjects, so generally you will have at least 2 autofocus modes. So these are separate to the actual autofocus points. So that's one part of the setting. That's telling the camera where in the viewfinder you want the camera to focus on. The other setting is how often do you want the camera to refocus. So generally there'll be 2. One of them is autofocus. It may be AFS or some other description, and that's a single autofocus shot, if you like. And what that means is that once you press the shutter button down halfway, the camera will set focus once, and it will that's it. It will not refocus. The other one is continuous autofocus. So you might see that as AFC. And what that will do is while you have the button pressed halfway down, the camera will continue to refocus all the time. So if you're using subjects that are stationary, AFS, the single autofocus, is fine because you've set your focus and that's it. There's nothing more to do. The subject isn't moving, assuming that you're not either, then that focal distance will remain the same. However, where you're working with moving subjects, so that could be something like motor racing, sport, wildlife, all of those sorts of things, the continuous mode might be more useful to you, particularly if that subject is moving either towards you or away from you. That way you've got you might have tracking or some other system on your camera, but basically you want to continue to refocus so that when you push the shutter all the way down, you've got the best focus on that subject at that point. Now, given that you may have AF systems as well, you might be able to set for eye autofocus, for example, where you can clearly see your subject eyes, or something else, depending on what the settings are that you're using. For me, as I've already said, if I've got it's either things in the background or things in the foreground that might upset my focus, I'll go for the smallest single point AF I can set up. So I don't want a wide AF zone. And that's generally how I do all my photography. I find so the reason for understanding this and understanding how it works for photography is you may well find that you set it up once and that's that. Okay, so that's using the area mode. The next one is faster, unpredictable situations. So this could be action photography, sports animals, all that kind of thing. Because the subject is moving, that can get very difficult for the AF system to track. So I've already covered that to a point. And basically, the thing to do there is to not use single AF focus. So you might have AFS. I think that's the Nikon version. Canon, I think, is one shot. You probably don't want that when the subject's moving. Switch to continuous. My tip is that you may well want one shot or AFS as your default setting, because that way, again, it depends on the kind of photography you're doing. But if most of what you do, you're working with stationary subjects, then that's where you want to be. With continuous, that's fine if you're working with movement more. But again, I only say this because I'm a big one for not changing things too often on the camera. I always check my settings before I do a shoot and before I take a shot, or if I've done a sequence, I'll just make sure I haven't accidentally touched something, which I might do with, for example, exposure compensation. But things like the autofocus system, I tend to use in one particular mode most of the time. And I'm guessing that you'll probably be doing the same thing. So essentially, look at the style of photography you're doing and adjust your AF settings so that they're most suited to that style. And then the final scenario I want to talk about is where you've got a very shallow depth of field. So this is where you're looking at those very small F numbers, so F1.2, F2, those kind of things. Because with those, because you've got a very narrow depth of field, if there's a tiny shift, that's particularly true if you're doing macro photography, and you may well want to do a manual measurement anyway, depends on the system and how it works. Any tiny shift in focus can, or any shift in any movement, can really mess up the focus. So don't do the focus recompose at wide apertures. Try and just focus on one and shoot. Avoid relying on a single AF point if there's a chance that the subject might move. So again, with those points, this is a scenario where you might want them wide enough, a wide enough group, to just cover any movement that might happen with your subject. Or you might want to use one of the AI modes to give you a bit more help in identifying what's going on. If the movement is too tricky, you might want to just change your aperture settings, make them a little bit wider, but obviously just wide enough that you're not interrupting the integrity of the shot, and take multiple shots. Again, this is a good one. So what I would do with things like dolphins, which move very quickly, so that's obviously not a macro situation, but where you've got fast-moving subjects that you cannot manually focus on, I will tend to set up I'll set up a focus box. I might switch to manual focus so that the AF isn't resetting itself. Or if I'm on back button focus, I'll set up a focal point, but then I won't change the focus after that. So this is another useful or another thing that makes back button focus useful, where you've split the focusing instruction to the camera away from the take a picture instruction to the camera. So you can set up a focal point, and then you set up a focal, I think of it as a kind of an in-focus box around my my focal point, and that's set by the aperture, sets your depth of field, and then fire away, take a lot of shots. So I hope that's given you a bit of help. Obviously, there are other scenarios where that might be confusing. So it might be if you're using an AI situation, but where there's lots of different, let's say it's trying to recognize someone's head, but you're in a crowd, then which one do you focus on? There's a bit of just common sense about it, really. Just look at how you've set your autofocus system, and have you given the system enough information to work for you, or are you having to constantly correct it? So you do need to obviously apply a little bit of intelligence with this. But the fundamental thing here is that autofocus systems like as much light as they can get. They want as much contrast as they can get. And when you're using autofocus, this is the key thing. Try and find something that's reasonably brightly lit, has good contrast, and that will help the autofocus system very quickly lock on to what you want to shoot. If you're in scenarios where that's not the case, you may well have to improvise, change your settings, as I've already spoken about, and that will give your system a chance to work. Or failing that, just go for a manual focus, give that a try, and just work with your depth of field and see what you can get, and take multiple shots, and hopefully at least one of them will work out to be good. Okay, so that's the first half, I suppose, of the discussion about focus, and that's obviously looking at the autofocus system itself and how it works. So what I'm going to talk about next time is the other part of the optical system that you're using when you are taking a photograph, and that's your eyes and your brain, because they can actually throw you a little bit as well. And you may well have had a situation where you've taken a photograph and all the settings are correct, but when you look at it, it just doesn't look sharp. So I'm going to talk about that and what you can do about that. So that's it for this one. If you found that useful, please give me a like and subscribe. Take a look at the website there. Take a look at the course. The course covers a lot of stuff in a lot more detail. It takes you from zero knowledge. So the whole point of this course is to give you everything, all the building blocks you need, so that you can then start to advance your photography, but you're doing it without gaps in your fundamental knowledge of photography. Okay, thanks again, and I'll speak to you in the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.